Hi, everybody, and welcome back. I hope you all had a good break. You were able to rest and relax and maybe catch up on what you needed to catch up on. So today we're going to be discussing food farming and famine with the realization that one of the most important ways in which human beings have affected the ecology of the earth and of the biosphere is by our need to grow and cultivate food. So that is going to be the topic of discussion today. And just to, put it in context, at the moment there are about 8 billion people on the planet. And we have to ask ourselves the question, how on earth are they all getting fed? And what impact does providing that food have on the planet itself? And we need to bear in mind that by the year 2050, we will be well more than 9 billion, closer to 10 billion people on the planet. Remember that we anticipate the population will stabilize by the end of the century between 10 and 11 billion people. And we're going to have to provide food for all of these people. And we're going to have to do it in a way which does a lot less damage to the planet than our current food production does. So let's just take a step back to what we learned previously about agriculture and human populations, and realize that 25% of the world's population are feeding themselves through subsistence farming. And that is actually an inheritance of the agricultural revolution, which took place approximately 12,000 years ago. And in subsistence farming, a group of people, it can vary in size. It might be a family. It may be a group of families. They may or may not be related. They may be in a tribal grouping or a clan grouping, whatever. But they cultivate a set area of land, and that is principally to provide themselves with all of the food that they need. And the idea behind that is not to produce so much food that they can sell it, but that they maintain their own nutritional needs from year to year. Now, in many cases, such groups would maintain the old hunter-gatherer kind of attributes if need be. They could go out and collect stuff in the environment, could hunt if they were low on protein, etc. But most of their needs would be provided by the land that they cultivate. And they will eat almost everything that they produce. They each year would grow enough crops that they could save seed for the following year. And in addition, they make use of simple fertilization techniques using animal waste or even human waste, composting, and so all of the waste that they produce goes back into the system to fund the next year's crops or animals or whatever. So it's almost a closed loop, not quite. It's not an ideal situation. But in extra years, they might be able to sell some of the extra, but by and large, they simply cater for themselves. So this system of farming is very widely used. As we say, about 25% of the world's population are providing their own food in this manner. And in terms of the environment, there are some distinct advantages to the system. And the first is that they have very little reliance on artificial fertilizer and almost no reliance on pesticides and synthetic chemicals, such as herbicides, insecticides, these sorts of things. All the material associated with the piece of land, whatever they are cultivating, is tightly recycled. So there's very little waste, and almost all the food will be consumed. If there is any food left over, it would usually be given to the animals to feed on, something like that. In addition, these systems tend to grow different species of plant in close proximity to one another. And they very often derive, especially at the time of the agricultural revolution, but continuing today, people will grow indigenous plants that are useful to them. And so what they're doing is they're maintaining a fairly high biodiversity in the small area that they are cultivating. And the problem with this is it's a very precarious way to do things, because the system is extremely dependent on weather and climate patterns. Come a drought or something like that can be absolutely disastrous. If the family loses a year's harvest, they not only lose that year's harvest, they lose the seed for the next year. And that can be absolutely disastrous. And over a wide area, such a drought could actually result in famine. And this frequently happens. You will hear very frequently, for example, in the Sahel Desert in Africa, in Bangladesh, in India, the onset of widespread drought can lead to widespread famine and mass migration of people giving up their land and moving towards the city in hopes of getting food or work that they can buy food. In addition, because they are not using pesticides, the onset of disease can also be absolutely disastrous to them. And they live literally hand to mouth. That's where the expression comes from. They work with their hands to produce what they eat. And any interruption of that can end up in a very disastrous situation. So overall, there's a kind of a romanticism that is built up in our minds about this sort of system. And it is, in fact, a system that many people have attempted to return to the small-scale farming, often done in an organic manner, which means the minimal use of pesticides and fertilizers, etc., relying on old methods. But it is not an ideal system in environmental terms. For a start, very frequently, these people using these methods of farming have resort to deforestation. They will actually go to an area of forest and will cut down all the trees and then burn the surface to clear it for their planting. And although this is often done on a small scale, if you have a lot of people, a lot of groups doing this, each burning their own plot of land, it begins to accumulate. And over time, there may actually be a significant impact of deforestation on the surroundings. Now, the other big problem is the actual soil usage, because the forests very often are depending on a really poor fertility soil. And the soil becomes exhausted. And what people then do is they pick up and they'll move away, slash and burn another area, and begin cultivating that. Sometimes they will allow grazing animals then to move on to their previous piece of land, which by then is probably just growing grass, something like that. And these grazing herds do a huge amount of damage. Even on wild lands, if you allow cattle to range on them, sheep to range on them, whatever, then they tend to strip the land to bare soil. They graze it down to bare soil, but they also, the impact of their weight and their movement on the soil ends up damaging the soil. And what we find is that areas of such land, once it's overused in this way, it no longer is able to maintain a basis of vegetation to hold the soil. And it is very easily eroded either by water, very often by water, by runoff. Instead of the water soaking into the soil, the soil is compact, and the top of the soil is bare, and water tends to now form rivulets, which erode away the soil from the top. This can become extremely severe. This is the beginning of one here. This is an advanced stage of soil erosion here. And this can proceed to such an extent that, in fact, it's especially in marginal lands, maybe which are already fairly close to desert. In marginal lands, this can lead to the expansion of desert, the creation of new desert. And this is a process called desertification. This is especially a big problem in Africa and in some parts of India and Bangladesh, Pakistan as well. So that kind of small-scale farming gradually gave way to a new kind of farming, which was a more commercial level of farming, in which people farmed for themselves, but grew extra in order to sell. And this was especially a feature of the agricultural revolution, when, for example, people began to gather together in towns and nascent cities, and the people in the towns and cities did not grow all of their own food. They may grow some of it, but they weren't able to grow all of their food, and so they bought their food, and that market was supplied by farmers from outside. As the human population began to grow, however, the need to produce enough food at a price which people could afford became intense. And in fact, as we look through history, and medieval history especially, we see that famine was a major factor in population, in the size of the human population, but also in people's movement. And if now the farms in the surrounding areas failed because of drought or because of flood or whatever, the people in the towns who had no way to produce all of their own food, they would be subject to the famine as well. As the human population began to grow even bigger and bigger and bigger, new styles of farming began to be developed. And especially in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, large farms started to become the norm because they could develop machinery. They could develop mechanical means of planting, plowing, harvesting, etc. And much larger areas could be planted and harvested. And the one tendency on those large farms was to reduce the number of different crops that they were producing. They tended to specialize. And they tended more and more to move towards growing only one or two different things in a particular season. And this has led to our modern systems of farming, which we refer to as conventional farming or industrial farming. And this is characterized by having very large areas of land used, and most of the activities on the land now being done by a few, relatively few people. Subsistence farming is labor intensive. But these commercial and conventional farms, they use far less labor because so many tasks are given over to very efficient machinery. So very large areas of land can be farmed. And in addition, in modern times, they tend to be monocultures. That is, they tend to be not only one species, but they tend to be one special variety, which is grown on that huge piece of land. And when we look at that whole area, we see it as a monoculture, just one species over a huge area of land. And that is now maintained by whatever machinery they can afford, which is state of the art. And can efficiently deal with these huge areas. So when we look at the world in general now, we see that the most visible thing that human beings have done to the earth in all of the years since the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago has been the transformation of wild habitats into farmland. And that has enormous impacts on the biosphere and on the global ecology. Only 1,000 years ago, only about 4 million square kilometers of land, that's less than 4% of habitable land on the planet, was given over to agriculture. Within 1,000 years, we have moved to the point where now half of the habitable land, half of it, is given over to agriculture to feed the growing human population. So this is a very interesting piece of graphic. I'll go through. Don't expect you to remember all the details of this, but we'll go through some of it just to point out to you the salient features. First of all, if we look at our planet, only about 29% is land. The rest of it is ocean. So we have 29% of land, about 140 million square kilometers. I'll have a word to say about the ocean in a minute. Of this 29% of our 141 million square kilometers, 76% is habitable land. That is, it's not covered with ice, it's not entirely barren without water or resources. So 76% of that is habitable. And we have, this graph says 45%. In fact, it is now close to 50%, has been given over to agriculture, 48 million kilometers squared. And this is cultivated land. And this is also land which is given over to herds for maintenance of cattle, sheep, goats, whatever. 38% of the land is covered with forest. And of course, this is decreasing rapidly so that this can be increased. I said to you, this says 45%. This was, I think, in 2008 or 2009. And it is now up to 50%. What we need to realize is that the human population is still growing. We're still adding 1 billion every 12 years. By 2050, we're going to have to be feeding close to 10 million people compared to the 10 billion people, sorry, compared to the 8 billion. This is where that extra is coming from. We are chopping down forest and converting it to agriculture. And by the way, have a look here. This is cities and towns, urban and built up land. So, we tend to think of our cities as being so enormous, and we almost picture our globe as being covered by cities and habitation and everything. It's actually relatively small. Urban built up land is only about 1%. Now comes the crunch. And remember this for your discussion group, okay, for the discussion that I've asked you to do. 45%, 50% now of land is given over to agriculture. For what? Well, 80% of that is for livestock. 80% is for meat, dairy, textiles, in other words, wool, things like that. And the 80% of the land converted to agriculture is given over to livestock. Only 16% is given over to crops, which provide us with all of our wheat, corn, all of the other crops, vegetable crops that we use. This is very remarkable, because when we look at the human population in general, when we ask, where do people get their calories from? Do they get their calories from livestock? No. The vast majority of the calories come from plant-based foods, What about their proteins? Well, 62% currently is derived from plant-based food. Plants, even though they occupy such a small area of the land, provide a huge amount of nutrition to the human population. But the meat industry, the livestock industry, rather, because not only meat, it's also the other things I mentioned. It provides relatively smaller input to human nutrition, but look how much land it takes to do this. It takes a huge amount of land to produce these relatively small benefits to the human population. And well, the plants grow on a relatively small amount of land and yet provide a huge amount to the human population. That bears thinking about. If we're doing forward planning, what are you going to plan for? Are you going to plan for more livestock to use up more forest? Or are you going to make efficient use of land and grow more plants? That's something that you can answer in your discussion group for this week. Okay, so this expansion of land over the wildlands, over habitable land, which is continuing, is one of the greatest drivers of deforestation. And with almost half of the land, of the habitable land currently being used for agriculture, if we're looking at most of that being used for livestock, then in actual fact, if you wanted to look at the globe, the amount of land devoted to raising livestock is the size of all of the Americas, South America, North America, the whole of North America, the North American continent. That is a huge amount of land devoted to livestock, which provide a relatively small amount of human nutrition. So there is something here which doesn't sound quite right. And the reason for this, that they take so much land, is because it takes around about 100 times as much land to produce a calorie of beef. Here they've given kilocalories. Okay, we'll say kilocalories, but its calorie would be the same. It takes 100 times as much land to produce equivalent amount of nutrition in beef or lamb or whatever, versus plant-based alternatives. To produce the same amount of calories, if you do it with plants, 100 times less usage of land. And the same is true for protein as it is for just for the calories. That is about 100 times more. So what we're going to have to do really is start thinking about dealing with these beasts and how our great reliance on livestock as a source of calories and of proteins, because it looks like we're not doing an efficient job of providing those for the human population in terms of land usage. So I'll remind you, we have discussed this before, but I'll remind you again that deforestation has disastrous and huge impacts on the global ecosystem. First of all, there's, as you can see here, this is in Brazil, by the way, and here the forest is being cleared for soybean production. So now what this does is it converts this biodiversity-rich habitat into a monoculture. Second of all, this land the forest grows on is actually, the nutrients are very, very poor. And the forest grows as vigorously as it does because the system is able to vigorously recycle every bit that it can to maintain the growth, to maintain the biomass. Once we strip away the forest, then we end up with a monoculture, as we do here. Then you may have a good crop initially, and because what you're depending on is all of the accumulated organic matter in the soil. But as time passes and as you go through your crops and harvest your crops and take them away, and especially as you take away all of the plant and you throw away all the unusable bits somewhere else, all of the nutrient leaves the soil. And in order to maintain crops, remember one of the reasons you're growing them here is there's a very good climate for it. So they maintain the high yields by dumping fertilizer on the crops and all of the accumulated problems that we're going to talk about in a minute that come with growing just one kind. The second thing that happens is you change the biome. You've changed the nature of the soil here. You've changed the nature of the vegetation. And if you do this on a large enough scale, you're going to change the climate as well. We see in the Amazon that areas which have been vigorously cleared end up going towards dry, almost semi-desert grassland. And because the rainfall is very much reduced, the rainfall over forest is very much higher than it is over these kind of monoculture farming areas. This is in Brazil. Here, this is also familiar to you. This is clearance of forest for palm oil production, and this is in Indonesia. But I will tell you that the area of the world which is now coming under the severest deforestation pressure is in Africa. And that is where the most deforestation is going to be taking place over the next 50 to 100 years. So here we see it here. This, by the way, is all that this graph is showing you is what drives deforestation. So don't get to understand exactly what these bars actually mean. So what this is telling you is that in Africa, here you can see this is deforestation effectively, and 80% of the deforestation in Africa is driven by plant cropland production, not by livestock, but by putting in plants. So at least we can comfort ourselves that probably this is a more efficient way of producing human calories and protein and everything. Nonetheless, there is a very, very significant deforestation taking place in Africa. But if we go to South America, we see a completely different picture. And we see that, in fact, expansion of deforestation, rather, for crop planting is a lesser part of the deforestation pressure. Most of the pressure, in fact, a huge amount of the pressure, is due to converting forest into rangeland, deliberately creating grassland so that livestock can graze it. You can look at the world, it's about even. If you go over the whole globe, you see here it's just about even between the two, between pressures for livestock and pressure for croplands. Those are the only points that you need to take away from this graph. Okay, so we're not only talking about deforestation. The deforestation is an immense problem, but there are all sorts of other things associated with modern agriculture and industrial agriculture. First of all, it produces a huge amount of greenhouse gas. There's 26% of greenhouse gas emissions that's more than a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions arise from food production. And I'll discuss that a little bit more on the next slide. Second of all, land usage, 50% of our land, of the habitable land, is already converted to agricultural use. and that is increasing. It will be significantly increased by the end of the century. Here is one which is tremendously important. Remembering that we actually have relatively little fresh water available to us on the planet. We discussed that earlier in an earlier class. 70% of fresh water withdrawal is for agriculture. Only 30% is for direct provision of water to human beings and to industry and things like 70% is withdrawn for agriculture alone. This is hugely important. We'll discuss it in a little bit more detail. And that is that the agriculture contributes very significantly to eutrophication. And in general, where intensive agriculture exists, it has huge impact on mammal and bird biodiversity, but also on other animal groups, as I'll discuss in a minute. So here's, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I just want to show you this. This is greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food produced. And you can see, look at beef. Look how much greenhouse gas emission is produced just from producing a kilogram of beef. It's huge. Lamb and mutton, 39 kilograms of greenhouse gases per kilo of product. Beef, dairy, beef, prawns. Now, okay, I'll leave this. I'll just discuss it in a second. Dairy products like cheese, pigs, poultry, all of our major agricultural greenhouse gas emissions are associated with animal protein production. I just want to point this out because I haven't talked about it much in the past, and that is prawns. Prawn farming is a huge industry all through South America and over much of the coastline of the Far East, Vietnam, Cambodia, all these, in China, all around the world. Prawns is a major, major product. Unfortunately, it's an extremely damaging industry because what happens is that they tend to take down natural vegetation like mangroves, wall it in, create huge ponds that they raise the prawn in, and in order, the prawn filter feed particles of food out of the water. In order to feed the prawns, they dump huge amounts of food onto the ponds. They also dump, in doing that, what they're doing is they're dumping fertilizer effectively because the prawns feed inefficiently. These are hugely wasteful farming methods, and they produce relatively small amount of protein for an enormous amount of input. And along with that, look at the amount of greenhouse gas, 27 kilograms of greenhouse gas per kilogram of prawn. That is a very bad statistic if we're talking about global climate change. You'll see that all of the vegetable production is far, far less. So I do want to just point out, though, that in food production, it's not only the fact that animals are breathing that is producing carbon dioxide. It is the land use itself distorts the carbon cycle. And if we are disturbing the land, we tend to produce more carbon dioxide, which is released into the atmosphere. So first of all, here's a breakdown for where those greenhouse gases come from. The first is just from the land itself. The second is in actual production of the crop, whatever it is. And the 31% is associated with livestock and fish farms. Now, this here is an interesting statistic, especially the livestock, because you've probably heard about cow fart as being a major source of greenhouse gas. Well, it is, excepting that's not fart. they belch the gases out. And the gas that cattle produce is methane. And that is a major source of greenhouse gas from livestock production. But I also want to point this out to you. So these are all things that we might expect if we're farming an area. But things we don't think about, and that is this. Look here. The whole transport, processing and packaging that must follow on the agriculture. We're going to produce a crop, but now you've got to process it, and you've got to package it, and you've got to transport it to its market. And those processes in themselves produce about 15% of the greenhouse gas emissions from the food production. So this is a very, very significant proportion of the greenhouse gas emissions from food production. Okay, so here we come to one of the major aspects of modern food agriculture, conventional agriculture or industrial agriculture. And that is, most of them depend upon growing a single crop. And not only a single crop, here, okay, pine, corn, wheat, and here's soybean. Huge areas are given over just to one kind of plant. But not only that, the fact of the matter is that these plants, the seed or the seedlings, are produced on an industrial scale, and they are produced by careful genetic selection of useful strains. And when we look at something like grown in monoculture like this, what we're looking at is not only plants of the same species, we're looking at plants which are essentially clones of one another. They are genetically virtually identical to one another. So very often you'll see these referred to as green deserts. And they are green deserts for a very good set of reasons that we're going to discuss now. They have virtually no biodiversity. They have no genetic diversity either. And that is almost intentional because there are advantages to growing stuff in a monoculture like this. And the first is the ease of care. All of the plants are genetically identical. They all require exactly the same conditions. They grow to exactly the same height. They can be grown at exactly the same distance apart. They require exactly the same amount of water and fertilizer, whatever. So they're relatively easy to care for if you're doing this on an industrial scale, and most of the work is being done by highly mechanized, automated machinery. Second of all, they're very easy to harvest because all of the plants are the same size if they're all treated the same. They produce their fruit at the same height, so they can be automatically harvested by mechanized means. Thirdly, the farmers no longer have to produce their own seed stock. In fact, there's no advantage to them in doing that. But the seed stock is bought in from the manufacturers, the growers who grow that particular strain. And the growers who produce the strain, they will keep an eye on what is happening on the farms. If there is disease entering that population, they will change the genetics. They will change the strain of seed that they produce the next year in an effort to avoid pests and disease. So the yields from such farming are absolutely enormous. They're huge. But those are all advantages. But the disadvantages of growing under these systems are ecologically enormous as well. And so, first of all, if you're growing plants which are essentially identical to one another, which are essentially clones, the genetic diversity is just virtually non-existent. If you get a disease coming into that population, every plant is as susceptible as every other plant, and it will soon run rampant through the whole crop. So That's problem number one. Problem number two is that if that is the case, you've got a limited amount of time that you can grow those plants. When you have had disease come into the area, it usually comes in, for example, with insects. Viral diseases are the real problem in these monoculture systems, although there are numerous other diseases that could, but viral disease is particularly important. Over a period of years, insect pests in the area will develop their own population of the virus. It doesn't harm the insects, but the insects act as a reservoir for the virus. So after a number of years, you can't grow that genetic strain of plant anymore. You have to change the genetic strain so that it's resistant to the viruses which are already in the environment. The third thing about monoculture is that the soil gets very, very rapidly depleted. The crop starts to require huge inputs of fertilizer in order to maintain the original yields. Fourthly, I keep my numbers all mixed up. Fourthly, the system of farming itself tends to damage the soil. We got these huge machines running back and forth over the soil the whole time that compacts and damages the soil. In fact, in the end, the soil essentially dies in these systems. The last thing is that these crops require a huge input of artificial pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides in order to maintain them, partly because of the lack of genetic diversity. Any disease that starts needs to be stopped immediately. They keep a careful watch on what is happening. If any disease arises in the crop, they blanket the whole crop with pesticides of whatever kind. And in fact, they very often do it prophylactically. That is, they do it on a regular basis to stop disease ever starting in the crop. This is hugely damaging to the environment. So monocultural industrial farming is really damaging on all sorts of levels. I'll point out one, though, which has had an enormous impact on American history. And that is that the industrial farming methods began to become popular around about 1910, 1920. And this was when there were huge improvements in farm machinery and people began to be able to farm larger areas. This caused all sorts of social problems as well. But the style of farming, of frequently tilling and deep plowing of the soil by mechanized means, plus the use of pesticides, destroys the natural soil communities. So the soil effectively dies. The heavy farm machinery compacts the soil, meaning that every year you have to till deeper. So you're continually disrupting the soil structure. Now, if anything happens, if you leave a field fallow, in other words, you don't plant it, or if you're forced to leave a field fallow because there is a drought or something like that, the topsoil is extremely liable to be eroded, and can be eroded by water, as we said before, but it can also be eroded by wind. And this situation led to one of the greatest agricultural and social disasters of American history, and this was the Dust Bowl of the 1920s. In the background here, I've got a picture of a farm of a town rather in Oklahoma, and behind it here you can see a huge dust cloud. This is a dust cloud which has arisen from farms. This is the topsoil of farms being blown off. This happened regularly, and farms ended up having this topsoil stripped almost completely. And farms had to be abandoned because they simply had no useful soil left to grow crops. I recommend the great novel of the Dust Bowl era is Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I'm not setting it as required reading for this week, but sometime it's worth your while to go and have get a copy and read that. So again, if we're looking at this kind of thing happening in areas of marginal land, we're talking about is increasing desert. We are actually changing the biome nature of these areas, removing topsoil, reducing the ability of vegetation to grow, changing the climate, changing it to a dry climate, in fact, and expanding desert. Second problem, I've already said, if you've got the crops that are all genetically identical, you have to use a lot of pesticides because pests, the insect pests in particular, may be damaging on their own, but they also transport disease, especially viral disease. So it's essential to maintain what becomes effectively an insect-free environment. And they do so by the use of pesticides, often sprayed one way or another, very frequently sprayed by airplane. The problem with that, this pesticide doesn't only fall onto the plant and affect its use there. It gets blown away into other areas, but it also ends up in the water, and it ends up being transported away from the farmlands into natural areas where it does an enormous amount of damage. Our current worldwide use of pesticides, 6 billion pounds of pesticide a year. And in the USA, we use about 25% of that on our crops, just in the USA. So here's another book that you need to read, another classic book, and that is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And that is the book which set off the environmental movement, another classic which you should try and read. So why are pesticides so damaging? Well, first of all, of course, what they're going to do is they're going to massively reduce biodiversity. Pesticides, we think of the three different kinds that we just talked about. Herbicides, which kill off weeds, insecticides, which kill off the insects, and fungicides, which kill off fungi. Fungi are also another major disease-causing organism in these farming systems. So first of all, let's think about the insecticides. Well, you're reducing insect populations, and that is happening worldwide. There has been a catastrophic decrease in insect biodiversity worldwide, and that is largely because of pesticide use, both in farms and in home gardens and in the home. And these pesticides, first of all, insecticides are artificial substances, most of them. They are very long-lived in the environment. And there is one other feature of them, which I'll discuss in a minute, which makes them particularly damaging. Fungicides, also very often artificial. That means they are not easily broken down by natural systems such as bacteria. They're also long-lived in the environment, and they are damaging not only to the disease-causing fungi on the plants, they're also very damaging to fungi in the soil. And so that it disrupts the entire community which is present in the soil. That is one of the reasons why these monoculture farms tend to have dead soil with very few organisms in them at all. The last kind of pesticide are herbicides. And the herbicides are to remove weeds from the crop. But here's the major problem. And that is, it's difficult to design an herbicide which will only affect the weeds and not affect the crop. And so what they have done is very largely now our crops are genetically engineered to be resistant to the herbicides. And so the herbicides don't affect the crop, but they wipe out all the weeds. They'll wipe out all of the other plants which they come in contact. Anything that's not genetically engineered to be resistant or be killed. Herbicide, this plane could as easily be spraying herbicide as it could be spraying insecticide. Again, you get drift of the herbicide away to affect plants outside. You get the herbicide entering the water system, affecting natural populations. But all of these things, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, can also affect us. And they do. They enter our waters, they enter our food. We eat fruit which has been sprayed with insecticide. We eat products which have been exposed to insecticides. And it is becoming apparent, in fact, that this is affecting the human population in many different ways, including our reproduction. So here's one of the reasons why pesticides are so dangerous in the environment. And this is one of the major reasons. Think back to our discussion about trophic pyramids. So here is a trophic pyramid, and this is an aquatically based pyramid. So here's in the water, we've got runoff from the farm, and we have pesticide. Let's say it's an insecticide or something like that. In this case, they're talking about the insecticide, DDT, one of the original insecticides, one of the first synthetic pesticides to be designed in the 1930s, and very, very, very widely and indiscriminately used. So let's say it was used on a farm. We got water runoff into the water system, and we have a very low concentration. We've only got, let me see the units here. These are parts per million. Don't worry about it. Just keep an eye on the units. So we've got a very low concentration in the water, but in the water we have algae, things like that, which absorb this pesticide. So here's our first important figure. So we've got, remember that only about 10% of energy and biomass is absorbed by the next trophic level. You remember that. Well, here's the thing about pesticides. Pesticides are completely artificial. They're completely artificial. The zooplankton, for example, will be eating a huge amount of primary producers here, but they only convert to biomass and useful energy about 10% of what they eat, right? But they take all of the pesticide that was present in that large amount that they ate in order to produce this small amount. So what they are doing is they are concentrating the pesticide. Same for the next step. Each of these, we're going up an order of magnitude, right? Sorry, yes, one order of magnitude. 10% absorbed, 90% is being built into the next level of the pesticide. 90% of the pesticide goes in. We start to concentrate the pesticide at higher and higher and higher levels, at each of these levels, until it accumulates to such an extent that it becomes toxic to the organism itself. And that is what happens. This is exactly what happens with DDT. It becomes concentrated, especially in aquatic systems, in large fish. Now, the large fish may in fact be affected themselves, but what is catastrophically affected were fish-eating birds. This top predator here is now getting we started off with 1,000 parts per million here of the producer biomass. Now we're getting 10 million parts in our top predator. And this is at a toxic level, which is going to affect the biology of the organism. This is exactly what happened. Around about the 1950s, it began to be noticed that bald eagles, which are fish-eating birds, bald eagles right across the United States, with their clutches were failing when they bred. They simply didn't produce any chicks. The adults as well appeared to be ill, and mortalities amongst the adults started to rise at the same time as their breeding success fell. And the reason that the breeding success fell was that they were unable to produce proper eggshell. The eggs were too fragile, and they broke when the adult bird attempted to roost them. They went into these populations, examined them. It took a long time for them to realize that what was killing the population of the eagles, in fact, was the accumulation of DDT, of an insecticide in their flesh. And for this exact reason, trophic pyramids concentrate pesticide. And especially at the top, the effects can be catastrophic. It was only with the regulation, with the banning and regulation of DDT, that the bald eagle populations in the United States were saved from extinction. They were very close to extinction. This kind of accumulation is still going on. Maybe not as obviously and catastrophically, but we know that many of the pesticides which are being used and entering watercourses are in fact being accumulated. And we are seeing effects particularly on vulnerable populations such as amphibians, the frogs, salamanders, all of those sorts of things, but also at the lower levels here. It is affecting the functioning of these low trophic levels as well. So that's pesticide usage, which is a huge problem. The second major problem is fertilizer usage. These monocultures require a huge amount of fertilizer, and that in itself is very, very inefficient. Excess fertilizer runs off the top of the soil, and it may enter the groundwater and percolate through the groundwater, runs off the surface into rivers and streams, etc. And this is a major contributor to eutrophication. You know, go back and remember what the process of eutrophication is. It's the excessive growth of organisms, primary producers especially, which end up exhausting the oxygen in the water and killing water, resulting in major fish kills and things like that. But this eutrophication also takes place at sea, and coastal areas are very, very susceptible to it. And it's mostly from agriculture, some from home gardening as well, especially in vulnerable areas like Florida. In addition, fertilizer actually contributes oxides of nitrogen. Remember, the most fertilizer is very, very, very rich in nitrogen. That's why you're putting it on the plants. It produces oxides of nitrogen, which are themselves greenhouse gases. The last thing is that fertilizer disrupts the natural processes in the soil. It disrupts the natural cycling of nitrogen and of phosphorus as well. And it contributes to the death of the soil, the inability of the soil to perform properly. In the end, in these monocultures, the soil actually ends up just acting as an anchor for the plant. And the plant is supplied all its nutrients from fertilizer, and is supplied abundant water because the soil no longer has organic matter in it, which can accumulate water. So the water usage increases, fertilizer usage increases, and along with everything, pesticide use increases as well. So again, this is the graph we saw before, but I just want to point out to you this issue of eutrophication. Here it is here. 78% of global eutrophication is produced from agriculture, and 22% from other sources that would largely be home usage, industry, and those sorts of things. I'll also point another thing out to you on this graph we're going to talk about now, and that is the use of fresh water. Agriculture accounts for 70% of our fresh water. You'll remember, Only 1% of the water on the whole planet is suitable for drinking and usage. Only 1% of all the water. And agriculture uses 70% of that. And that is increasing year by year as these farms increase in size. The problem with this is that water use is very, very inefficient. And these monocultures have a huge demand for water. The inefficiency leads to huge water wastage. And as I've mentioned already, soils that are damaged in the way that they are by these industrial farming methods, they lack organic matter, so they don't hold water properly. A lot of it just runs off the surface. But it also may enter the subsurface and seep away. But very little of it actually re-enters the groundwater. So we're exhausting the groundwater, which lies deep, pumping to the surface, and then it's running off and being wasted. Also, a lot of it simply evaporates, of course, as well. So when we start to deplete the aquifer is the water store which lies underneath the soils in the rock area, everything else. But as we start to exhaust that, we draw all that water out. Something's got to happen. It can't sit there. There can't be like a vacuum where we withdraw the water. For years, we've depended on the fact that the water was replaced by water from other aquifer sources. But that is beginning to end now. We are beginning to exhaust our aquifers. And when that happens, there are two phenomena which are being noted. The first is that the land begins to sink. The aquifer actually provides support for the surface layers. As we deplete the aquifer, the land begins to sink and subside. But the second thing is many of these aquifers are underlain by a layer of salt water. And as we withdraw the fresh water, it is beginning to be replaced by salt water. We then pump that salt water up onto the surface soils, and our crops are no longer able to grow. There's another thing, and that is in order to satisfy the demand of agriculture and industry as well for water, we resort to damming rivers and then manipulating the flow of water, directing it towards the places where it is needed. But these systems dramatically reduce the ability of rivers to provide all of the ecological services that they normally provide. So water use is a major problem. We are running out of water. We're literally running out of water. And the water that we do use, we're using inefficiently and we're using badly and causing a lot of ecological damage. Okay. I tell you what, I am going to stop here for myself and take a little break. Of course, the video carries on because I'm going to come back and start it again. But I suggest that you take a break as well. Either take a good long break, come back and do this, or do the second half of this lecture tomorrow, if that suits you. Okay, so we're all back again. So we could move on now to the question of how on earth are we going to be able to feed everybody? How are we going to be able to feed, first of all, the population we have now, population we have in 2050, the population we have in 2100? These enormous increases in numbers of human beings mean that we have to have a concomitant increase in the food production, and along with it, an improvement in the methods of food production and the methods of transporting and producing, packaging and everything else, as we've already seen. So how much food do we actually need? How much do we produce now? Well, we currently produce about 4 billion metric tons per year of food. And our food needs currently are 3.7 billion metric tons. So we overproduce. We are overproducing food. And the efficiency of food production is actually increasing especially as technology improves. So this difference is growing greater. And we have to ask ourselves, how many people are going hungry in the world? Well, it's about 800 million people are calorie starved on our planet. So something is very wrong. Something's gone badly wrong here, because we're overproducing food on a global basis, and yet we have close to 1 billion people who are close to starving. And that's the topic that we're going to address now. We need to increase our food production to about 6 to 7 billion to about 6-7 billion tons by 2050 if we're going to cope with population increase. So how are we going to do that? Oops. First of all, those 800 million people who are hungry, we need to get a different definition first about what hunger is. Hunger is distress. It's the feeling of distress that is associated with a lack of food. And the threshold for adult human beings is 1,800 calories per day. If you get eating less than 1,800 calories a day, you are actually going to start consuming your own proteins, your own calories, your own fat, and everything else. Undernutrition is a term which is used specifically to address the fact that some people have enough of one kind of nutrient. They may have enough calories, for example, provided by their diet, but not enough protein. So it's the deprivation of a specific set of nutrients. And in many cases, for example, deprivation of vitamins and minerals may end up causing disease. The term malnutrition is actually badly used. We often think of malnutrition as being starving people, but in fact, malnutrition means badly nourished. And people who are malnourished may actually be undernourished, but other people may be overnourished. Both of them, both the product of starvation and the product of overeating, are malnutrition. And there's another term which we need to get used to, and that is food security. Food security relates to the food availability. It means you have food available, you have access to it, you have the money to buy it if you need to buy it, and you are able to use it, that is presented to you in a way in which it can be used. And when people have access to all of that, we refer to them as being food secure. But you must realize also that those 800 million who are undernourished, they are obviously not food secure. But there are many more people than the 800 million who are food insecure. There are many people who have adequate food supply now, but slight changes could mean that they would be deprived in the future. And if we have a look at the breakdown, 14 million children worldwide suffer from acute malnutrition. 45% of deaths worldwide are due to hunger and related causes. And one of these I'll show you now. 1,000 children every day die from illnesses that are caused by dirty water and unhygienic living conditions. So how does this connect to malnutrition? Well, these conditions are typical for impoverished communities, and especially things like refugee communities, communities under conflict, those sort of situations, where along with food insecurity and undernutrition, they are subject to the lack of infrastructure for purification of water and that sort of thing, and are very much more vulnerable to disease because they are weakened by malnutrition. Many of these children are dying from diarrheal diseases. In a child who is already malnourished, already has a low body weight, the onset of diarrhea can dehydrate them within hours and kill them. And that happens. It happens on a constant basis. And I might have mention of some specifics in a minute. So in developed countries, we see two kinds of malnutrition, and they are these. This is in America, by the way. And this is severe undernutrition of a child. And I do a prompt diagnosis to tell you that this child is suffering from major protein deficiency. But we also see this, and this is obesity. And childhood obesity is an increasing problem in the United States, but also in some countries where a middle class is developing alongside a food industry, which is providing cheap food, which is very high in sugars and fats and salts. Now, this points to the fact that malnutrition is very often a product of poverty. And you may think it's strange for me to say that this could easily be an impoverished family, but it is true, because this huge meal that you get at McDonald's or wherever, any fast food takeout or whatever, is in fact extremely cheap, because it's manufactured through industrial farming methods. It is produced through industrial methods, and that all lowers its cost and makes it very freely available. So very often in poor communities living in a rich society, this is their source of nutrition, is takeout and things like that, which are very often very, very high in fat, very high in salt, very high in sugar, and all the rest of it. Look at these. What are these kids drinking? They're drinking bottomless cup, probably, of high fructose corn syrup. That's all that it is. And high fructose corn syrup is extremely sweet, but it actually bypasses the body's normal abilities to determine its sugar content. And it ends up being metabolized into fat. So the child is getting fatter and fatter and fatter, not only because of the food that they're eating, the French fries and everything else. They are also getting fat because of this. It's a high dose, in actual fact, of body fat that they're taking in, but it is cheap. It is cheap. And if as parents, you are struggling to make ends meet, this may be what you resort to in the end. So these are clinical manifestations of really acute undernutrition. And these are typically seen poor developing countries, but also in areas of conflict, in refugee populations and people like that, where the food train has been disrupted. The ability of society to produce food for these people is disrupted. Their ability to grow their own food has probably been stripped from them. And this is a child who's suffering from a condition called marasmus, and that is the typical skeletal look of a body that is eating its own protein. And when you starve, the first thing that happens is that you begin to mobilize the easy reserves in your body. Then you mobilize the fat in your body. And then once that is gone, you start to mobilize protein, particularly in muscle. That's what produces the skeletal look. All the fat is gone, so that's why the face looks like a skull. All the fat has been used up. And this child, unfortunately, at this stage, there's nothing much left to metabolize. And so the body starts to harvest protein from its own organs, and especially from the brain. And this is why childhood malnutrition is so very dangerous. It's because the child will suffer after effects. And the child will be scarred in its development by malnutrition. This is another condition equally as dangerous, but a little bit more difficult to spot, because these children often look as if they're quite healthy. They can look, he's got a little tummy, and his face is chubby, but he's not healthy at all. This child is suffering from chronic deficiencies of calories. They are using up all their reserves to provide the energy for the body to continue. This child here is being given enough calories. He's actually able to function energetically because he's been given the calories, but he's suffering from a lack of protein in his diet. And it produces this typical look. He doesn't have his hair, they've shaved his head, but you may just be able to see around the edges here that his hair is actually an orange color. They always have this little pot belly. This pot belly is not because he's full. This pot belly is there because his abdomen is full of fluid. The same thing happens in the face. He gets fluid build up in the face. You give him this chubby look. So this can be very, very deceptive. And you can actually have a situation where children suffer from both. They suffer from both marasmus, and this is called kwashiorkor. Now, in an adult, adults are able to withstand periods of starvation far better than children. First of all, they have a higher body weight to start off with, but also they're not in a developmental stage. So once they are fed again, they return pretty much to their original. When you take a child who's been severely malnourished for a long time, you can feed them, you can get them to look normal again. But as I said before, their development is scarred. So this forms a long-term societal problem. So why? Why does this happen? Why is it we're overproducing food globally? And yet we have all of these people who are either patently undernourished or else are food insecure. So something is going wrong somewhere. And the fundamental problem is that hunger is a problem of power. The distribution, the production and distribution of food is determined by people who already possess, they already own. It is not determined by the people necessarily who are producing. So, for example, there are a lot of people who are farming to make a living for themselves and their family, but also to make some money, etc. They farm other people's land. The land actually belongs to somebody else, and that somebody else determines what they grow and also determines how much they get. And they determine how much food they will get, and they may determine also how much money they get for the extra that they produce. That's a simple example of a power structure. But remember that most food production and worldwide is determined by large companies, for example. It is determined, those policies are determined by people who have access to power. They have access to the government agencies which determine overall agricultural policies and determine how things are going to be produced, how they're going to be processed, and what is to happen to them. And there are many areas of the world which have large populations of poor, starving people who are exporting all their food. the food leaves the place where it's needed so it can be sold elsewhere, maybe in another country. That is what's meant by the hunger being fundamentally about power. But there is one area as well, which is of huge importance, and that is within societies, it is marginalized people who suffer from hunger the most. And when we look at it, those are women, first of all, then people like refugees, displaced people, and those people with disabilities. And these are the people who are particularly at risk. And then include in that the children, because children have very little power. They have very little power to determine policy or anything else. They are absolutely dependent on adults and on adult decision. And this issue of the women I'll come back to in a minute, because it actually turns out that it is extremely important. And you have already seen that when we discussed human populations. We discussed the importance of women in determining the future of whole society. When you lower the inequality that women suffer from in many areas of the world, you actually raise up the whole society, because it is the woman who becomes able to make decisions for the family, and she often knows far better than anyone else what her family needs. So, what are the causes of this terrible deprivation? Well, first of all, some people just simply can't afford to buy food. These populations of people often are living on a vanishingly small amount of money. And in most societies, the vast majority of societies nowadays depend on money as the exchange mechanism in order to get things. And for example, here in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is absolutely typical for many, many, many African countries. Democratic Republic of Congo has a population of 90 million, rapidly increasing. It is a very high increase rate there. 37 million of that 90 million, 37 million don't receive an adequate diet in terms of the calories that they absorb. And this is clearly linked to the fact that their earning ability is very, very low. Now, most of these people are in huge shanty towns in cities, huge informal settlements in the cities, desperately scrabbling to try and make a little bit of money. And in the Congo, $1.25 a day is what people earn to feed a whole family. So that explains a lot. But I have to tell you that this is very typical in Africa. This is a very typical scenario for many, many African countries, which is why African countries have such high rates of malnutrition amongst their populations. The second thing is there may be regional shortages of food, especially due to climate change, to climate rather, and to weather events such as droughts and floods and things like that. So there may we see at the moment these regional food shortages in a band across the middle of Africa, from the Sahel all the way across. And these regional food shortages may affect millions of people. So the onset of a climate event can affect a lot of people and drive them into food insecurity. This is a major one. War and conflict are amongst the greatest producers of wide-scale famine and poor nutrition. That's for many reasons. Wars disrupt food production. Think, for example, about farmers farming and feeding their families and producing enough that they can sell, save some money, etc. a war arises in their region, and they may be driven into refugee status. Now, what that does is it interrupts the farming process. So the farming stops because they've got to flee. They've got to go into a camp, or they've got to leave the area. But it doesn't only disrupt it for that year. It means that that farm is not producing seed stock for next year. And in fact, in many cases, families will take their seed stock with them because that's the only food that they have. They haven't produced new yet, and they may have whatever they have left, they take with them, and they have nothing left to plant the next year. And in addition, very sadly, the starvation may be used as a weapon. It may be used as a weapon to weaken a population. And it especially is used as a weapon to turn a population against not the people who are fighting them, but against their own authority, because there's nothing like hunger to drive civil unrest. It has sparked enormous revolutions in human history. So we are seeing exactly this. In this modern day and age, starvation is still used as a weapon of war. And we are seeing this in Sudan, in the Yemen, and in Gaza, and in Myanmar as well. Areas are being deliberately deprived of food in order to induce starvation in the population. And in doing so, they not only weaken the population, but they provide a means of moving the population, of forcing the population to move in one direction or another. Think of a huge starving population, and if you tell them, if you can move there, we will feed you. They will go there. It is a blunt force weapon against populations, and it is catastrophic, especially when you consider the damage that is done to children. The next thing we have to consider is that poverty is being exacerbated by climate change. The farmers are losing the ability to manage their own farms because things are happening to their land of which they have no knowledge. Many of the farmers, the 25% of subsistence farmers around the world, they depend upon ancestral knowledge for doing what they do. And if the climate is changing, they don't have the wherewithal to work with the new conditions. In fact, the new conditions may be impossible to work with. The result of this is that we are seeing an increasing number of people forced into migration. They are forced to leave their land and migrate, often to a city, to another country, wherever, in an attempt to find food to feed their families. And we're going to see that even more and more. We talked in our human population section. We talked about the threat of mass migrations of human beings driven by climate change. This is one of the reasons. Many places, they may have adequate parts of the diet, but lack certain things that I've already discussed. The next thing that really drives this systems of poor provision of food to the population is simply public policy. Many countries, the governments steer their resources not towards the people who need them the most. They direct them to the people who have the most, because those are the people who maintain the power structures. So we see that increasingly wealthy people are acquiring more and more and more wealth, while poorer populations are deprived. Now, that is not a political point of view. That is a simple fact. It is a fact of the inequalities of the global systems that we are facing. And one of the effects is to deprive much of the population of access of access to improvement, access to food, etc., etc. It is public policy that decides what the food chain is, how the food is produced, what is produced, how it is to be processed, and how it is to be transported, and where it is to be transported to. We've already heard that. But seldom included in all of that consideration is ensuring that the poorest people in the population receive an adequate amount for their needs. The last thing I would say is really important, and it pertains to what on earth are we going to do to improve these systems. Do you know that 1/3 of the food produced, a full 33% of the food produced in the world, is simply wasted? It is allowed to rot, sometimes deliberately, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes deliberately because prices need to be maintained at a high level. So the food is sequestered and disposed of. Sometimes inadvertently because systems break down, infrastructure may be poor, electricity supply may be poor, etc., etc. Storage, refrigeration may break down or not be available. Fully 1/3 of food goes to waste. And it is not, when it goes, I say it goes to waste, it goes to waste. It goes to the landfills or wherever and ends up being converted into carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas during the rotting process. It's not composted, put back into the soil or anything like that. It's simply wasted. And this is one thing which needs to be addressed if we're going to be able to feed our 10 million people in the very near future within your generation. So, sorry, this. So, I've presented you with a whole lot of really major problems. You can do a lot more reading about this. And I've just set a number of exercises for you to go through to examine this. You realize I have skimmed through a very, very complex, difficult topic. It's a fraught topic because it covers all sorts of things: sociology, biology, ecology, political theory, etc., etc. But we have to address the fact that a substantial number of people on the planet go hungry, and that number is actually increasing. It shouldn't be. We have the technology and everything else to ensure that it doesn't, but we lack the societal will to see to it that we deal with things more equitably. So what can we do? Well, the first is that we need to improve efficiencies. We need to improve efficiencies of land use. We need to restructure those soils that we've destroyed. We need to restore forest, not cut down more. We need to restore forest, and we need to use the land more efficiently to produce food. Especially, critically, water usage has to be improved. Somehow or other, we've got to improve the way that we use water. We need to start recycling water instead of throwing water away down our toilets and letting it go out to sea. We need to start recycling water. We need to start recycling industrial water, not just pumping it into the rivers and letting it go to waste. We need to improve irrigation systems on the land. We need to improve processing, storage, and transport of food. We need to improve refrigeration systems so that food doesn't go to waste. We need to get that 1/3 of food into the food chain so that that food can be used, not just thrown into a landfill to cause more global warming. And we have to improve the availability of food. And we constantly see this situation where there is abundant food, but people can't access it. They can't access it because they don't have the money. But in addition to that, I want to tell you something really important. And that is that it's very expensive to be poor. If you think about, I'll give you a simple example. If you are very poor, you're living literally hand to mouth, you only have a very small income. Where do you go and shop? Do you go and shop at Costco or BJ's and buy in bulk? No. First of all, you can't afford it. Second of all, you don't have a refrigerator to put the food in and store it. So what do? You buy single-use food, right? You buy food which you're going to use immediately, that you don't waste a thing. You don't want it to go off or anything, so you just buy a little bit. That costs. Buying a single potato is very much more expensive in the long run than buying a sack of potatoes. And I'll give you a real life example. I live in East New York, which is one of the poorest areas of New York. Our food in East New York, where the people are poorer than anywhere else in New York, our food here is more expensive than if I go to Trader Joe's on Union Square. Why? Why? Because, first of all, because they can. That's the first. Here's your power structure. Somebody owns the supermarket, the little supermarket that we have here. Somebody owns that and determines the prices. And they push the price as high as they can. And the people in this area don't have political power. So they don't feel able to squeak and scream to get the prices reduced. During the inflationary period that we've just been through, we have seen our food prices increase far above the nationwide inflation. Why? Because they can. And in addition, this is a small supermarket. So they are not buying in the sort of bulk that a giant supermarket like Trader Joe's can buy in. They don't have access to the sorts of markets that those powerful companies have. So they themselves are forced to deal with higher prices. You see how it all feeds down. And it ends up that, in fact, being poor is a very expensive undertaking. You end up paying a lot more. Your cost of living is far higher if you are poor than if you are wealthy. It's a sad fact, but it is true. The next thing that we have to do is we have to make farming sustainable. We can no longer hammer the earth to produce our food. We have already caused crises in water, in the usage of water. We've caused crises in the eutrophication of oceans offshore. We've caused crises, huge crises of biodiversity. Agriculture alone is one of the single major reasons for the biodiversity and the mass extinctions that are taking place at the moment. And that is largely through things like pesticide usage. All of those need to be re-examined. And in the exercises that I've given you, you will hear a number of suggested ways in which this could be done. We have to make use of natural recyclings. We have to use up the organic waste usefully, put it back into the soils. We need to sustain biodiversity. We cannot live on this planet if we lose our insects. We simply can't. We will not survive. We will not survive the death of all the insects on the planet. And here are our two bellwethers, the insects and birds. We need to watch those populations. Both of them are declining rapidly, along with other things as well, like amphibians and everything. But insects and birds are things which are intimately involved in our food production. They should be part of the structuring to allow high biodiversity. And that will ultimately improve the efficiency of our agriculture. And lastly, we really need to empower the powerless. We need, for that great mass of people who are stripped of power and reduced to hand-to-mouth living day-to-day living. We need to empower them. And the main way to do that is through women, through women's education, through through making available to women all of the opportunities that we make available to men. And once we do that, it's estimated that if we did that, there'd be 130 million fewer people who would be food deprived. That's an actual statistic. It's not a wish. Okay, so I just want to tell you that this has been quite a long lecture for you, of course. I know that. And I've set a number of exercises which I really, really want you to do really well. I really want you to go through all of those and pay attention, take careful notes. But I have not set this week, I have not set a worksheet for you, and I've done that deliberately because I want you now to go to the discussion, and I want all of you, every single one of you, to make a real effort with the discussion this week, because this is a really important topic, and it's a topic which touches us all. We all eat, we all drink water, and that needs to be top of our consciousness about how we get it and everything else. So this week's discussion, I'm putting you in front of the United Nations, and I'm asking you to tell the United Nations, given everything that you learned from this lecture and then from the readings and everything that you do, I want you to tell the United Nations what to do. Where should our efforts go in order to improve this system? Improve our food production so that people in need get it, as well as people at the top of the food chain. But second of all, how we can do that in a way which not only doesn't damage the earth, but which may actually restore ecological systems. All of those answers are suggestions for all of those answers are there for you. So please pay attention to the discussion this week. And in order to reward you, if you do so, remember, good contribution from yourself, good interactions with the other people in your group. And there's 25 points associated with this week's discussion, not 10 as normal. And then I will see you again next week.